The National Dex controversy surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield is one of the biggest blunders for the series in a very long time. But it also isn't really a controversy. On a surface level, Pokemon fans are paying more money for less Pokemon, which is inherently a bad thing. However, this whole situation surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield is actually much more complicated than it might seem. You see, while it's easy to critique Pokemon Sword and Shield for its obvious flaws, you also have to realize that these games don't exist in a vacuum. After all, this is the 8th generation of Pokemon games spanning over 20 years, and if you look more into things, there's a lot of missing context leading up to the release of these games that paints a different picture for this whole situation. Anyways, with all that said, let's get into it. Well, I could simply explain what happened and why people are upset, but it wouldn't properly explain the context of everything that's led up to this point. You see, while it's true that a lot of hardcore Pokemon fans are upset and have written off Pokemon Sword and Shield as the worst Pokemon games of all time, there's also a much larger majority of casual fans who don't care. Which, in my opinion, is a much more interesting discussion. I mean, if this was supposedly the largest controversy in the history of the series' existence, then why was this the case? Well, we'll get into that in a minute, but for now, what is the National Pokedex? Well, for the first generation of Pokemon, the National Pokedex did not exist. In Pokemon Red and Blue, players were tasked with completing the Pokedex by discovering and catching all 150 Pokemon by exploring the game world and collaborating with other players through trading Pokemon. It was kind of obnoxious how some Pokemon were exclusive to certain versions and how some could only evolve after they were traded, but besides that, it was entirely possible to complete the original Pokedex if you had access to both versions. This same system continued once again with Pokemon Gold and Silver, but with a somewhat different approach. Once again, players were tasked with finding and catching Pokemon to complete the Pokedex in the new world of Johto with the addition of 100 new Pokemon, but after you've beaten the game, you unlock the ability to travel back to Kanto, as well as unlocking an alternate Pokedex mode which presents the Pokemon in proper chronological order. This made the goal of completing the Pokedex become an even more daunting task, but it was still entirely possible to find and catch almost every Pokemon in the game by traveling between both regions. Things started to take a major dive with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire when the series transitioned to the Game Boy Advance. For Generation 3, they included 135 new Pokemon and only brought back 65 Pokemon from the old games, resulting in the entire roster only having 200 of the 386 Pokemon that existed during the time. And if any of the old Pokemon weren't included into the Pokedex, then they didn't exist in the game and you couldn't catch them. Huh. Doesn't that sound familiar? Needless to say, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire was a major step down from the previous games, but the Pokemon Company was able to retroactively fix the problem by releasing new games which allowed you to transfer over the missing Pokemon back in. If players traded missing Pokemon from Pokemon Emerald, the Gen 1 remakes, or the GameCube games, the in-game Pokedex for Ruby and Sapphire would be updated to include the missing Pokemon and present them all in proper chronological order. And thus, the National Pokedex was born! A fucking half-assed, afterthought solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed. Anyways, to put it simply, the creation of the National Pokedex was poorly thought out to say the least. Unlike the previous games where you only had to transfer a handful of version exclusives or trade evolutions from the opposite game, the National Pokedex required you to transfer over hundreds of Pokemon from multiple games and generations. Honestly, it was at this point in time where I finally stopped caring about completing the Pokedex because the inclusion of the National Dex made the collection process completely miserable. Of course, if you're a huge fan of Pokemon and you have access to all these games, then I suppose it's not that big of a deal. But as someone who really enjoyed the experience of actually having most of the Pokemon available in one game, it was extremely disappointing. From Generation 4 and onward, this is how the National Pokedex continued to operate. Instead of simply including all the Pokemon between two different versions, Game Freak continued to release a stripped-down Pokedex featuring mostly new Pokemon, and once the player fulfilled a certain criteria or beat the game, you could update your Pokedex to the National Pokedex and were then given the impossible task of completing it. Now, obviously, I'm being a bit hyperbolic. It is technically possible to complete the National Pokedex with enough time, patience, and money. However, if you're just some cute kid who saved up your weekly allowance for an entire year to buy a Nintendo DS and play Pokemon Diamond and Pearl as your first Pokemon game, you're essentially being set up for failure. Of course, the remakes of the first 2 generations helped to alleviate the process, but honestly, completing the Pokedex by spending 12 hours on GameFAQs every day hoping to meet some fat Asian kid with an action replay was clearly not the intended design philosophy of Gen 1 and 2. That's not even including the fact that the legendary event Pokemon are essentially impossible to get unless you're somehow able to fly all the way across the world to attend some random pre-release event at Tiananmen Square to play fucking hopscotch to get the Celebi download code. At the end of the day, being required to transfer over hundreds of Pokemon from a bunch of completely separate games shouldn't be the solution to completing the National Pokedex. Every Pokemon that exists during the time should be obtainable in-game by only trading between the 2 latest versions. This is how Pokemon Red and Blue worked, and Pokemon Gold and Silver almost worked the exact same way, with the only missing Pokemon being the Gen 1 starters, Fossil Pokemon, and the Legendary Pokemon, which could easily be transferred over from Pokemon Red and Blue with little to no hassle. Meanwhile, completing the National Pokedex for the later generations of Pokemon is just absolute nonsense and isn't worth the effort. To put it simply, it was an endgame activity designed exclusively for psychos. Anyways, not to go too far off the rails, this was essentially how the Pokemon games continued to operate. Pokemon Black and White did the same thing. Pokemon X and Y split up the regional Dex into 3 parts, but still included the National Dex in the same manner, and it wasn't until Pokemon Sun and Moon where things started to change. With the 7th generation of Pokemon, Game Freak started to address some of the minor issues with the series and decided to remove the National Pokedex from the game. Now, some people might be a bit confused right now. After all, the entire outrage surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield is that they supposedly removed the National Pokedex, so why weren't people upset with Pokemon Sun and Moon? Well, the difference with Sun and Moon is that you still had the option to transfer over missing Pokemon, with the only difference being the removal of the in-game National Pokedex, which incentivized players to complete it. Now, for me personally, the removal of the in-game National Pokedex was a good change. With over 800 Pokemon existing at this point in time, the logistics of completing the National Pokedex became a complete clusterfuck. And the removal of it in Sun and Moon came across as Game Freak acknowledging that the entire process of completing it was not worth doing. Having a cut down roster of Pokemon consisting of mostly new Pokemon was still kind of lame, but at least with the removal of the National Dex, players were more likely to be incentivized to complete the regional Dex by finding and catching all the Pokemon within both versions of the game, which I personally think embodies the spirit of how the Pokedex was meant to be completed. In fact, this was the only generation of Pokemon since Gold and Silver where I actually decided to complete the Pokedex because the goal was much more obtainable. Now, obviously by completing the Pokedex in Sun and Moon, I didn't technically catch every single Pokemon that ever existed, but I was able to find and catch every single Pokemon in the game, which at the very least is a much more honest approach. After all, the reason most players stopped caring about completing the Pokedex after Gen 2 was because the National Pokedex tasked players to find and capture hundreds of Pokemon that fundamentally did not exist in the game world. Meanwhile, with Pokemon Sun and Moon, if someone decides to start playing it as their first Pokemon game, they will effectively be able to complete the Pokedex by trading alongside the other version, which is how Pokemon was always meant to be. Sure, you can't technically catch them all, but at least with Pokemon Sun and Moon, you can catch them all in Sun and Moon and get rewarded for completing the Pokedex in Sun and Moon. At the end of the day, the removal of the in-game National Pokedex was a major improvement and I will never miss it. Obviously, I'd still prefer if every existing Pokemon was always in the latest Pokemon games, but at least this new approach was much more transparent with the fact that the missing Pokemon aren't obtainable. So, after a lot of anticipation for the next mainline games being on the Switch, Nintendo eventually released the trailer for Pokemon Sword and Shield. Overall, I'd say the first impressions for the game were pretty positive. I mean, obviously, it wasn't setting the world on fire or anything, but if you were a fan of Pokemon and you bought the previous Pokemon games, then you were most likely excited for it. At this point in time, the only thing people were complaining about was that the new Pokemon looked kind of dumb, which, let's be honest, is something that's brought up almost every generation. Anyways, the trailer was received received fairly well until the developers of the game revealed that if any Pokemon weren't included into the new game's Pokedex, then you wouldn't be able to transfer them over into Pokemon Sword and Shield, which effectively meant that if they weren't included into the regional dex, then they didn't exist in the game in any capacity whatsoever. Huh. Doesn't that sound familiar? Anyways, this resulted in a pretty modest backlash, with fans demanding Game Freak to re-implement the ability to transfer over missing Pokemon back into Sword and Shield, which is why it was dubbed the National Dex controversy, because the ability to transfer old Pokemon back into games where they're missing is synonymous with the creation of the National Dex from Generation 3. During the time, I'd say the initial outrage was pretty justified. However, as more information about the game was revealed and Game Freak continued to not budge on the issue at all, it quickly spiraled into a complete shit show. Now, if you're familiar with the kinds of videos I've made in the past, it should be pretty clear by now that I absolutely hate obnoxious fan bases. This is something I've never hidden. In fact, I've made tons of videos in the past where I go on lengthy tirades specifically about obnoxious fan bases, whether they're giant elitists or meme lords or just really dumb or misinformed. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that I've never pulled my punches when it comes to covering topics like this, and honestly, I could have an entire fucking field day with this whole controversy. But here's the thing. Ranting about all the specific details surrounding the National Dex controversy is a waste of fucking time, because the politics surrounding Game Freak's decision doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Game Freak removed the National Dex because they imported the models wrong, or if Game Freak lied about spending more time creating better animations, or if the higher-ups of the Pokemon Company are rushing the game out to line up with the anime release or the plushies, or if the Pokemon Company are maliciously conditioning people to expect future games to always have less Pokemon. Like, it doesn't matter why it happened. Like, who fucking gives a shit? All that matters is that Pokemon Sword and Shield removed the ability to transfer in missing Pokemon, and if that sounds bad, then just don't buy the game. End of discussion. That's it! Now, obviously, as we all know, most people didn't respond that way. After all, the players affected by this change are some of Pokemon's most die-hard loyal fans who are insane enough to actually complete the National Dex to begin with. To make matters worse, Game Freak was also dealing with the competitive Pokemon players as well, who are debatably even more psychotic since they're willing to not only complete the National Dex, but are also spending hundreds of hours of their free time breeding and min-maxing the absolute perfect Pokemon only to go online and play a glorified game of rock, paper, scissors. Like, these are the kinds of people who stabbed kids with pencils in 4th grade. Like, Game Freak pissed off the wrong group. After all, the hardcore fans who actually jump through all the hoops to continuously transfer Pokemon between every game have essentially lost more than half of the roster of Pokemon they most likely spent most of their lives collecting, which is why the outrage was so massive. On the other hand, for the majority of the fan base who never transfer Pokemon between any of the games in the series, the Pokemon which appear in the regional decks are the only ones they'll ever use anyways. So the entire controversy doesn't even impact them in the slightest, which is the complete opposite scenario. Meanwhile, all the hardcore Pokemon fans are losing their minds over this whole National Dex controversy to stir up outrage to get people to not buy the game, but if they explain it to anyone who's ever played Pokemon before, they just sound completely misinformed. It's like, oh my god guys, if a Pokemon isn't in the Galar Regional Dex, then they just don't exist in the game and you can't use them. Isn't that crazy? And it's like, yeah. Welcome to every fucking Pokemon game since Ruby and Sapphire. This is how it's always been since like 2003. Where the fuck have you guys been? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Game Freak here. I think the whole National Dex situation is completely ridiculous and they should have included every Pokemon into Pokemon Sword and Shield. However, when I say that, what I mean is that they should actually be in the game and not included through this half-assed band-aid solution that's been in place for the past 15 years. Honestly, the only thing this whole controversy has proven to me is that hardcore Pokemon fans genuinely believed every Pokemon has been in every single Pokemon game prior to Pokemon Sword and Shield, which in reality hasn't been the case since Gen 3 started. Now, obviously, after you've beaten a Pokemon game, sometimes you'll unlock a new patch of grass in the post-game where you can catch a Ponyta or some shit, but those situations are an exception to the rule. For the vast majority of Pokemon in the National Dex, you have to purchase a bunch of completely separate games and catch the Pokemon in the games that they're in, and then transfer them over to a game that they're not in. That's why they're not in the fucking game. In the grand scheme of things, if you can't find a Pokemon in the wild and throw a Pokeball at it, or evolve it from another Pokemon without the use of trading, then those Pokemon are unobtainable regardless of the National Dex's inclusion, which is why for the majority of the fan base, this entire controversy didn't matter. In fact, in an alternate reality where Game Freak decided to do a complete 180 and re-implement the National Dex prior to Pokemon Sword and Shield's release, 95% of the player base wouldn't even notice the difference. They would play these games with the National Dex included, and it would be as if nothing had ever changed. So if this was the case for the vast majority of players, then why did this whole controversy even snowball into a giant mess to begin with? Well, the truth of the matter is that the Pokemon fanbase spans an incredibly wide range of players who have entirely different opinions on the quality of the series, but up until this point, there hasn't really been a reason to complain. For the first 7 generations of Pokemon, Game Freak has always been delivering a consistent experience that has been gradually improving over time, and despite how painstakingly slow it may seem at times, it's still technically true. Of course, it's easy to criticize a series for following a similar blueprint for every single release, but if Game Freak wanted to put out some groundbreaking open-world next-level Pokemon game, there really wasn't anything they could do. Any improvements which could be made from a technical standpoint could only be done at the whims of Nintendo putting out more powerful handheld systems, which, for the most part, have all been vastly underpowered. On the other hand, Pokemon Sword and Shield is the first mainline Pokemon game to be featured on a handheld system powerful enough to also function as a home console. So not only was the removal of Pokemon from Gen 8 completely disappointing, but the technical constraints placed on Game Freak simply don't exist anymore. So there's really no excuse. That's why, despite the fact that the entire National Dex controversy didn't really matter, it still allowed longtime fans to finally release a ton of pent-up frustration and complain about the Pokemon series, which is what the rest of this video will be about. Now, to truly understand my own perspective on the series, I think it's important to note that I'm not a super hardcore fan of Pokemon. For the most part, I play Pokemon games as single-player RPGs. I start every game from scratch, play through it till the end of the game. Sometimes I'll continue to play if there's some interesting post-game content that keeps me interested, but that's about it. I realize that the multiplayer and online components have always been a major part of these games, but in my experience, they're simply a means to an end for completing the Pokedex, and I have absolutely no interest in the competitive aspects of Pokemon whatsoever. Honestly, despite how negative this video may seem so far, I do play and enjoy just about every new generation of Pokemon. Having a stripped down roster of Pokemon for every game since Gen 3 has been disappointing, but it's also kind of hard to care when the whole appeal of a new generation of Pokemon is to use all the new ones. The most enjoyable aspect of a brand new Pokemon game is running off into uncharted territory and finding some weird new monster to add to your party. So when you enter a cave and find Zubat and Geodude for the 10th game in a row, it's like, who gives a shit? While the National Dex has completely killed my drive to complete the Pokedex, I can still build up a team of entirely new Pokemon, have a fun time playing through the game, and reach the end credits, at which point I can just stop playing. So going into Pokemon Sword and Shield, I guess you could say I had very low expectations. All I was expecting was that it'd probably be at a much higher resolution, there'd be some interesting new batch of Pokemon to use, the wild area would be kind of cool, and they'll probably continue to improve on the quality of life features from Sun and Moon. Pokemon Sword and Shield was going to be a glorified 3DS game rendered at a higher resolution on the Nintendo Switch. And as a longtime fan of Pokemon who's been following every game since Gen 1, I don't know what else you could have expected. After all, Game Freak have been dragging their feet for the past 20 years on underpowered handheld systems, so expecting them to suddenly put out some mind-blowing Breath of the Wild-esque experience in only a couple years is frankly kind of stupid. To put it simply, it's taken Nintendo over a decade to finally put out a handheld system that's stronger than the fucking PSP. And the only reason Game Freak made a mainline Pokemon game on a console in the first place is because they're essentially being forced to do it, which isn't exactly the most ambitious position to be in. In the grand scheme of things, if the Nintendo Switch wasn't a hybrid successor to both the 3DS and the Wii U, I'm sure Game Freak would have gladly continued putting out another Pokemon game on Nintendo's massively successful line of Fisher-Price, leapfrog, bullshit handheld systems. So I had no reason to expect anything other than a standard, run-of-the-mill Pokemon game. For me personally, that was my own expectations for Pokemon Sword and Shield, but as you already know, a lot of fans did not feel the same way. The outrage surrounding the whole National Dex controversy was going in full force, people were throwing full-blown temper tantrums on social media, and any honest discussion you can have about these games have essentially been hijacked by obnoxious people who are arguing in bad faith because their only goal was to dissuade people from buying Pokemon Sword and Shield. People are complaining about the battle animations and the graphics and the removal of the National Dex, and after months and months of wasted energy and pointless hashtags, the games finally came out. I picked up Pokemon Sword, I sat down, played through it, and it's just another fucking Pokemon game! It's the same exact shit as every other game in the fucking series. You pick between the 3 starter Pokemon, you go through the routes, you catch some new Pokemon, you get your Pidgey, you get your Caterpie, you get your Rattata, you get your RC Cola Pikachu. You run into that one Pokemon which looks dumb that's usually made from a human object, never complains about it in every fucking game. It happens every fucking game. You travel across the world and get the 8 gym badges by fighting the gym leaders. You have a rival who you always beat in every single battle. Right after getting the 7th gym badge, there's some sort of story event which involves the legendary Pokemon and another evil team organization in some way. However, this time, just like in Sun and Moon, the evil team organization is actually a bunch of losers who you team up with, and then the good guys who are obviously the bad guys turned out to be the bad guys. And after you dealt with them, you go to your final Elite Four challenge and beat the champion, and oh my god, you're gonna get that goddamn Master Ball. There's only one of those things in the fucking game, and you're gonna throw it right at the Pokemon on the box art. I mean, it is by the numbers exactly the same as every Pokemon game that's ever existed, which is why it sold 6 million copies a week after its release, because the entire National Dex controversy didn't fucking matter. At the end of the day, the outrage surrounding the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield was purely about the missing Pokemon. And all of the other complaints about the battle animations and the mediocre graphics was essentially diehard Pokemon fans pretending to be upset over technical issues they've never cared about. Now, I know I sound like an asshole when I say that people's feelings aren't genuine, but a lot of longtime Pokemon fans upset over this whole controversy just come across as fucking hypocrites. During this entire controversy, Pokemon fans were screaming at Game Freak over the animations and the graphics, despite the fact that anyone upset over the National Dex controversy has purchased and played the previous 3DS Pokemon games, which all have the same exact problems, and they didn't fucking give a shit. No one gave a fuck. In fact, once Game Freak releases the inevitable sequels which reintroduces the missing Pokemon back in the game, then all these Pokemon fans who complained about the battle animations or the graphics will still go out and buy them regardless of whether or not those issues are resolved, which is why this entire controversy was a waste of fucking time. Meanwhile, these people actually had the audacity to call everyone who played Pokemon Sword and Shield a bunch of brain-dead consumers, which has to be the most ironic shit I've ever seen. After all, the minimum qualifications for even completing the National Dex to begin with is to be a corporate cocksucker. To even have the ability to obtain every single Pokemon, you have to purchase and play every single Pokemon game. And just because these diehard Pokemon fans are suddenly ashamed of swallowing the cum from Pokemon's dick for the 11th time in a row, it doesn't make them any less of a whore. The only reason Game Freak started putting out 4 versions of the same game is because these dipshits would actually go out and buy them all. Meanwhile, all of these diehard Pokemon fans are labeling anyone who buys Pokemon Sword and Shield as a bunch of corporate cocksuckers while they're posting screenshots of them canceling their pre-orders of the Pokemon Sword and Shield double pack. Like, is this shit for fucking real? Like, that's right, Game Freak. I'm not buying the same game twice this time. Like, oh wow, you sure showed them. Fucking dumbass. At the end of the day, the kids growing up with this new generation of Pokemon aren't the ones who drove it into the ground by blindly supporting it, and it's not the longtime casual fans who are buying multiple versions of the same game and being trapped in Game Freak's shitty business model. Now, don't get me wrong, it's perfectly fine to be upset over the missing Pokemon in this new game. It's fucking bullshit, and Game Freak fucking sucks dick. Overall, the Pokemon Company clearly have enough money and resources to fix these problems if they actually wanted to. But don't pretend to actually have standards when you've been sucking Pokemon's dick for the past 20 years. In the grand scheme of things, if you're someone who loves Pokemon and you're obsessed over having every single Pokemon, then you'll eventually buy the first Pokemon game that fixes the problem and transfer them over whether you want to or not. The only players who are upset over this whole situation are the customers that Game Freak will never lose. As long as they have a complete monopoly over the mainline Pokemon games, then there really isn't much hardcore Pokemon fans can do other than flat out refuse to play them and dump their entire roster of Pokemon, which they will never do. Now, it's at this point of the video where I can imagine that some dickless nerd out there will leave a comment and say that Digimon Cyber Sleuth is a much better alternative to Pokemon Sword and Shield. But honestly, no one fucking gives a shit. I don't care if Digimon Cyber Sleuth is the fucking Citizen Kane of monster catching RPGs, because the whole appeal of Pokemon games is the Pokemon. After all, the reason fans were so upset over the National Dex controversy was because they couldn't use the Pokemon they've grown attached to in the previous games. So it doesn't matter if Digimon Cyber Sleuth has the greatest turn-based combat system of all time, or if the graphics look amazing, or if it has the best story. If Pokemon fans genuinely cared about all those things, then they wouldn't be fans of Pokemon in the first place. Pokemon games have always looked mediocre, the stories were always terrible, and the turn-based combat system was designed for toddlers. But despite all of those flaws, Pokemon fans have a nostalgic, childlike attachment to the series, and that's all there is to it. The reason why Pokemon is so successful is because it's dominated video game culture since its inception, while also having TV shows and movies and trading cards and plushies and toys and merchandise and fucking Pikachu. They got fucking Pikachu, alright? Even your senile grandma dying in hospice knows who fucking Pikachu is. That shit was in the Macy's Thanksgiving parade! Did you ever see Digimon during that shit? No, you didn't, because Digimon fucking sucks dick and no one gives a fuck. Alright, do you guys really think Digimon Go would have been just as popular? Like, shut the fuck up. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Digimon Cyber Sleuth or Yokai Watch or Temtem or any other monster catching RPGs are technically better, because as long as they don't have Pokemon in them, it'll never be a substitute for the mainline Pokemon games. It's as simple as that. Meanwhile, this whole controversy has opened the floodgates for people to critique Pokemon Sword and Shield by comparing it to these other games, but it almost doesn't matter, because those same flaws affecting Pokemon Sword and Shield can just as easily apply to every previous Pokemon game, including the National Dex controversy, which has already happened before. Honestly, before these games came out, I was actually planning on giving a more in-depth, lengthy critique on Pokemon Sword and Shield, but now that I've sat down and played through it, it just seems like a fucking waste of time. I mean, what could I say at this point that hasn't already been said for the past 20 years? The turn-based combat is always the same, the stories are incredibly formulaic, the gym concept is fucking played out, the new Pokemon are pretty fun to use, but I wish they just include all the Pokemon in one game, the alternate game versions come across as a scam, a lot of the gimmicks don't really add much to the experience, Mega Evolutions might as well not even exist anymore, Z-moves are just fucking dumb, I think the new regional variants of old Pokemon is just pointless fan service, they're essentially just wasting great design concepts which could have been used for creating new Pokemon instead. Dynamaxing is fucking stupid. It's so fucking stupid, and yet at the same time, I still played Pokemon Sword and thought it was pretty good. It's by far the most streamlined Pokemon experience I've ever played. Having portable PC boxes right from the get-go was an amazing addition that should have existed years ago. Unlocking the ability to fast travel right near the start of the game was incredibly convenient. Having all the Pokemon appear in-world removed the tedious nature of surfing and traveling through caves. The way the bike seamlessly navigates both land and water removed all the pointless menu usage while traversing the world. You can heal up your Pokemon at campsites and spend less time constantly backtracking to the Pokemon Center. And Pokemon can relearn any of their old moves whenever you want by just visiting a nearby Pokemon Center and just talking to some dude. At the end of the day, if you've enjoyed any of the previous Pokemon games, there's only so much you can hate about these games. In fact, for the first time in the history of the series, the wild area actually feels like a new gameplay concept that could be improved on for later games and transition the series to the open world, massive Pokemon experience that the fans are looking for. Now, do I think that Game Freak will capitalize on this by making much more ambitious sequels on Nintendo's home consoles? Honestly, I have no clue. Now that the mainline series is on a home console, I can envision a future where Game Freak will constantly improve on what they've currently established and eventually make something amazing. But at the same time, if it's taken them 7 generations of Pokemon to finally realize that HMs were awful, then I honestly have no faith. As long as Game Freak continues to develop the mainline series in such a soulless and systematic way, I don't see it happening anytime soon. In my opinion, the biggest problem with the Pokemon series isn't even the graphics or the gameplay, but more so the fact that Game Freak has always had the option to do something different or shake things up if they actually wanted to. At its core, the entire appeal of Pokemon is exploring new areas, catching new Pokemon, and leveling them up in Pokemon battles. And outside of that core gameplay loop, you can literally do anything and tell any story you want. I mean, how depressing will it be in 20 years when Game Freak finally makes that ambitious, open world, massive Pokemon game that all the fans dreamed of, only to have to travel between cities, collect the 8 gym badges, and stop some fucking dumb team organization from using the legendary Pokemon on the box art to cause some cataclysmic natural disaster in order to fulfill their goals of world domination or some stupid shit like that. Like it happens every fucking game, and it's so stale at this point. I mean, clearly there's tons of obvious things Game Freak could do to improve the mainline series, but at the end of the day, Pokemon fans seem pretty content with having more of the same, and as much as I can sit here and complain about it, these issues aren't really that big of a deal for me. For the most part, I appreciate Pokemon games the same way I'd appreciate a hamburger from McDonald's. At the end of the day, I'm about to pull up to the Pokemon drive-thru, get a double cheeseburger, fries with a fucking Coke or whatever, and you know what? It ain't half bad. Sure, I suppose I could sit outside the building and protest until they start improving the quality, but if I actually wanted to have a high quality experience, then I'm not going to fucking McDonald's. And yeah, McDonald's does have a shit ton of money and they could put out higher quality stuff if they actually wanted to, but they won't do that because the reason they make that much money to begin with is because their entire business model is based off putting out basic, run-of-the-mill bullshit that's good enough. I mean, I can understand why some fans are frustrated, but it's not like Pokemon has been this high-quality masterpiece series that's been slowly degrading over the years. It's always been the same base shit since Pokemon Red and Blue, which is why despite all these issues I've talked about, these new Pokemon games are still fun to play. Now, if you voted with your wallet and decided to not buy Pokemon games anymore, then you should continue to do so. But for everyone else, they'll probably continue to play them and enjoy them for what they are, and there really isn't anything wrong with that. Which brings us to our final discussion. Pokemon Sword and Shield are getting a DLC expansion, and the few remaining Pokemon fans who are still upset over the National Dex controversy, which as we all know basically amounted to nothing, are still upset at this DLC because I don't know! I mean, instead of Game Freak putting out a third version of the same game with maybe 1 or 2 new additions, it seems like they're just making it DLC for the previous games, which in my opinion is completely fine. The only downside to having it become DLC is that if you're the kind of person who waited for the improved versions later down the road, then that option doesn't exist anymore. However, for the vast majority of Pokemon fans who most likely ended up buying both versions anyways, you're essentially paying less money money to get the extra content, and the DLC will make Pokemon Sword and Shield better games in the long run. Of course, there's some fans who are upset because the DLC is adding in 200 new Pokemon into the game, but once again, if they explain it to anyone who's ever played Pokemon before, they just sound like a fucking idiot. It's like, oh my god, guys! They're adding in 200 new Pokemon into Pokemon Sword and Shield, but the only way to catch them is to buy the DLC or transfer them over to the base game. What the fuck? They're putting the Pokemon behind a paywall. Isn't that crazy? And it's like, yeah! Welcome to every fucking Pokemon game since Ruby and Sapphire! This has been Game Freak's business model since 2003, you fucking idiot! The reason the National Dex system sucks is because since Generation 3, the Pokemon missing from the regional Dex have always been behind a paywall. It's always been this way! Now, it is technically possible to transfer every new Pokemon from the DLC back into the base game and not spend any money if you want to, but most players will never go through the hassle. After all, the entire reason those Pokemon double packs are even sold in the first place is because hardcore players committed to completing the National Pokedex are essentially required to play through both games and trade Pokemon by themselves. The transfer process between all these games is so miserable to begin with that it's basically designed that way. The Pokemon series built up the trading system as a way to complete the Pokedex by collaborating between friends, but nowadays even the best of friends wouldn't even bother with this shit. I mean, not only do you have to spend hundreds of hours catching and training up hundreds of Pokemon across multiple games, but you also have to sit around for hours and transfer everything over to a single game file and essentially give all of your Pokemon away to someone else through the kindness of your heart, gaining absolutely nothing in the process. Like, who the fuck is going to do that? Now, back before the National Pokedex existed, this wasn't really the case. With Gen 1 and 2, it was entirely possible to meet up with a friend who's playing the other version, trade over your handful of version exclusives, and call it a day. But when you have to transfer over hundreds upon hundreds of Pokemon, it's never going to happen naturally. So guess what? Go out and buy a second handheld system, get all the versions you need, and have fun playing through all these Pokemon games and complete the National Dex by yourself. To top it all off, Game Freak still continued to improve all the sprites and models between each generation anyways. So really, the data for all these missing Pokemon are all there just sitting in the game cartridge. The only thing they would have to do to make every Pokemon exist in every game is to just spawn them in certain areas so you can catch them. But obviously, the National Dex became a part of Game Freak's business model to sell more Pokemon games, so they decided to keep the system going despite the fact that they didn't have to do it anymore. Meanwhile, while this DLC is still putting the new Pokemon behind a paywall, at least they'll all be included into Sword and Shield alongside the old roster by spawning them in the new areas of the game, which in my opinion is way better. If the end result of having this DLC is that we'll eventually have every Pokemon in one game by paying the same price of multiple versions, then it'll still end up being much better than the National Dex system, despite the fact that it's still completely fucked up. Like, don't get me wrong, the 200 new Pokemon are being put behind a paywall, and it's fucking bullshit. But why are Pokemon fans upset over this now? When Pokemon has been so scummy for so long, why is this suddenly an issue? I mean, it's not even like Pokemon fans are upset that they finally realized they're being scammed. It's that they're upset they're being scammed the way they're not used to. Like, this has to be the stupidest shit I've ever talked about. In conclusion, this entire controversy didn't matter. Casual fans will continue buying the games and having fun, and hardcore fans will continue voting with their wallet until Game Freak finishes modeling all the Pokemon and puts them all back in, and then they'll stop giving a shit. Either way you feel about this whole situation, the Pokemon series will continue scamming its customers by paywalling Pokemon between multiple versions and DLC, and it won't change anytime soon. Still, despite all those problems, I'll probably pick up Gen 9 and have fun playing it, because despite Pokemon's terrible business model, I'll still have fun playing only one version. And yeah, I could protest the Pokemon series until they improve it, but whatever, it's not really my problem. I'm not buying more than one version, I'm not transferring all my Pokemon between games, I'm not paying a subscription service to keep my Pokemon on life support, and I'm not planning on buying this DLC either. In the grand scheme of things, I'm simply a bystander to a controversy that doesn't impact me at all. And yeah, I suppose it'd be better for me to stand up for others who are affected by this, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal, you fucking nerds. Alright, you can be upset about the state of the Pokemon series and this whole controversy, but we're not dealing with fucking Jim Crow here. It's just a fucking video game. Like, who gives a shit? In my opinion, as long as Game Freak continues to release new generations of Pokemon games that are fun to play, then I'll probably keep buying them and I'll have no remorse. Still, despite how apathetic I am to this whole controversy, the National Dex system has always been shit. At its best, it's a terrible solution to obtaining every single Pokemon, and at its worst, it's an awful business model which gatekeeps Pokemon between games for absolutely no reason, and only makes the series worse for the vast majority of players who will never put up with the hassle. As of right now, the majority of the fanbase doesn't even bother with this shit anymore, and the hardcore fans who completed the National Dex are already passionate enough to buy every game anyways. So removing the whole system wouldn't even affect their profits. It just feels like a poorly thought out business decision which just needlessly cripples every game. I mean, I suppose they'll technically make less money if they ever decide to stop selling two versions of the same game, but the amount of revenue generated from customers double dipping on both versions has to be incredibly small. Overall, I feel like the respect they're losing by doing all this scummy shit isn't really worth the benefits. Anyways, I suppose that sums up my thoughts on this whole mess. While the National Dex controversy was just kind of dumb, at least it gave me the opportunity to talk about Pokemon's terrible business model and why it caused the fanbase to stop caring about completing the Pokedex. At the very least, I hope this whole controversy will incentivize Game Freak to address some of these issues. If there was any time for them to start changing things for the better, it would probably be with these new home console entries. So despite how cynical I am, I'm still somewhat hopeful for the future of Pokemon. After all, the flaws with the series are incredibly apparent and are very easy to solve. At some point in time, Game Freak will eventually have to catch up with the rest of the world and address these issues. So the real question is, how long will it fucking take? Will it happen with Gen 9? Will it take another 10 years? Will I even be alive when Pokemon starts getting better? I don't fucking know!